Last night, Jimmy Kimmel Live erupted into chaos as Jimmy Kimmel clashed with Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, in a brutal on-air confrontation that left the audience stunned and the internet ablaze. It was supposed to be just another tense but manageable night on Jimmy Kimmel Live. With Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, scheduled as the guest, everyone backstage knew sparks would fly. But no one, not even Jimmy's producers, could have predicted the powder keg that exploded in front of millions of viewers last night. The show started off with its usual energy. Jimmy's monologue took its expected shots at the current administration, a few jabs at Trump himself, and even a biting joke aimed at Melania Trump, suggesting that her marriage was more of a hostage situation than a love story. The crowd, mostly loyal to Jimmy's brand of biting late-night humor, erupted in laughter. But the atmosphere shifted noticeably when Karoline Leavitt walked on stage. Poised, confident, and unbothered by the roars of the partisan crowd, Leavitt stepped into the lion's den like she had done it 100 times before. She smiled politely, shook Jimmy's hand, and took her seat, crossing her legs casually as if she had not just been insulted moments earlier by her host's jokes. Jimmy wasted no time. "So, Karoline," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "how does it feel being the youngest mouthpiece for the most controversial administration in modern history?" The crowd laughed again, sensing blood in the water. But Karoline didn't flinch. She smiled coolly. "Well, Jimmy," she said, tilting her head slightly, "it feels like an honor to serve a president who actually fights for the American people, instead of pandering to celebrities for applause." The audience gave a mixed reaction. A few cheers, a lot of boos. Jimmy smirked, sensing the tension brewing. "Fights for the American people?" Jimmy shot back. "You mean by lying to them, gaslighting them, and blaming everyone else for his mistakes? Is that the kind of fighting you are proud of?" Again, Karoline remained calm. "I think fighting for Americans means securing our borders, defending our freedom of speech, and not bowing down to the same media elite that routinely lies to the public every night, including shows like this." The room buzzed. Jimmy leaned back, visibly irritated. "Well, I guess it is easy to defend him when you live in a bubble," Jimmy said, his voice sharpening. "Maybe you could explain how First Lady Melania feels about living in a golden cage while the country burns?" A few audience members gasped. Even some of Jimmy's biggest supporters seemed unsure about that blow. Karoline narrowed her eyes just slightly, her expression still composed. "Jimmy, you do realize that making up tabloid-level attacks on someone's marriage does not make you look informed, right? It makes you look desperate." The audience erupted again, this time with a noticeable mix of laughter and applause. And not all of it was for Jimmy. His jaw tightened for a split second before he plastered on a forced smile. Trying to pivot, Jimmy doubled down, hammering away at Trump's record, labeling him a wannabe dictator, and accusing the White House of running a propaganda machine. He even pulled out an edited clip of Trump speaking at a rally, attempting to make him look foolish. Karoline watched the clip patiently. When it ended, she leaned forward, addressing both Jimmy and the audience directly. "If you have to doctor footage and misrepresent quotes to make your point, maybe your point is not as strong as you think it is. The real misinformation in this country is not coming from the White House. It is coming from studios like this." The crowd stirred. There were murmurs, an electric tension building in the air. Jimmy, sensing he was losing the upper hand, became noticeably more aggressive. He interrupted Karoline repeatedly, cutting her off mid-sentence, mocking her and talking over her responses. He tried to trap her into admitting faults, but every time Karoline responded with poise and clear articulation, calmly reinforcing her defense of the administration and her disdain for media manipulation. Finally, in an attempt to corner her, Jimmy threw out a question that was clearly designed to humiliate. "Tell me, Karoline, when you look at Trump, do you see a savior, a strong man, or just your meal ticket? The crowd oohed, expecting her to falter. Karoline smiled, shook her head slightly, and replied, "When I look at President Trump, I see a leader who took the arrows so the American people would not have to. You can mock that all you want, Jimmy, but millions of Americans know the truth, even if you refuse to say it out loud." There was a brief silence, the kind that only comes when an audience does not know whether to cheer or boo. Jimmy looked thrown off, his smug demeanor slipping. He opened his mouth to retort, but stumbled for just a second. A second too long. It was in that moment that everyone watching realized this was not going to be another neatly packaged late-night beatdown. No, this was different. Karoline Leavitt had come ready for war. And Jimmy Kimmel, the seasoned late-night gladiator, was suddenly looking like the underdog. And that is when the confrontation took a turn nobody could have expected. Jimmy, visibly rattled now, leaned forward in his chair, gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles whitened. You could almost feel the temperature in the room spike a few degrees. His smile thinned into something harder, meaner. His voice dropped, low and biting. "You know, Karoline, there's a fine line between loyalty and delusion. Maybe you are just too young to know the difference." The audience roared at the insult, sensing Jimmy trying to claw back momentum. But Karoline's reaction was devastatingly effective. She smiled sweetly, the way someone does when they know they have already won the argument. "Or maybe, Jimmy," she countered smoothly, "you have been in Hollywood so long that you forgot what loyalty to your country actually looks like." A few audible gasps shot through the crowd. Even Jimmy's longtime fans could feel it. This was no ordinary celebrity showdown. This was a bare-knuckle political brawl playing out on live television. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he pressed on. He brought up the January 6th riots, accusing Trump, and by extension Karoline, of enabling chaos. His voice rose with each accusation, almost trembling with anger. "You and your boss encouraged an attack on democracy," Jimmy shouted, his face flushed red. "You cannot come here, sit in that chair, and pretend like you stand for America when you sat silently while maniacs stormed the Capitol." Karoline sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She waited until the last echo of his outburst faded before answering, her voice calm but cutting. "Jimmy," she said, "I was not silent. I condemned any violence that occurred that day, just like President Trump did. But you, and people like you, conveniently ignore those facts because you need the American people to be afraid. Afraid enough to hand over their freedoms, afraid enough to trust you instead of trusting themselves." The crowd buzzed again, unsettled. Jimmy opened his mouth, but Karoline, seizing the moment, kept going. "You are not angry about January 6th, she said sharply. "You are angry that millions of Americans do not believe you anymore. You are angry that your version of reality is falling apart, and instead of facing that, you attack anyone who refuses to bow down." Jimmy barked a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, please," he sneered. "You sound like you are reading from a script written by Fox News and conspiracy theorists. You come out here looking like a Stepford politician, spouting lies to defend the indefensible. And you," Karoline shot back, "sound like every bitter, out-of-touch celebrity who thinks mocking half the country will make them love you more." A stunned silence fell over the set. For a second it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jimmy blinked, thrown completely off balance. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically signaling to wrap up the segment early, but it was clear Jimmy was not ready to let this go. His ego, bruised and bleeding in real time, demanded a response. He shifted tactics, trying to paint Karoline as part of a dangerous cult of personality around Trump. He brought up conspiracy theories, fringe internet groups, wild accusations that Karoline herself had never even mentioned. It was a messy barrage, growing more desperate with every passing second. "You are part of a movement that is poisoning this country," he snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. You are brainwashing people into thinking they are victims when they are the ones destroying everything." Karoline simply shook her head, her voice steady and controlled. "Jimmy, the only people poisoning this country are the ones who call half the population irredeemable. The ones who sit on late-night television, calling themselves moral while ridiculing working-class Americans who love this country. You do not get to lecture anyone about unity when all you do is sow division." A slow clap started in the audience. Just one or two people at first, almost tentative. Then it grew louder, more confident. Jimmy looked around, startled. This was not the reaction he had been expecting. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Jimmy turned vicious. "Do you even believe what you are saying, Karoline? Or are you just another grifter trying to score points with a base that worships billionaires who would not cross the street to help them?" Karoline leaned in, her voice low and firm. "I believe in America," she said. "I believe in freedom. I believe in the right to speak the truth, even when it is unpopular with the Hollywood crowd. And if standing up for those things makes me a grifter in your eyes, Jimmy, I will wear that title proudly." Another round of applause broke out, louder this time. Jimmy's face hardened. He glanced off camera, clearly looking for a producer to step in. There was none. They were letting it play out, probably recognizing the viral moment unfolding before them. It was then, for the first time in his long career, Jimmy Kimmel looked cornered on his own stage. And Karoline Leavitt, the political outsider, was the one standing tall. Jimmy slammed his cue cards down onto his desk, visibly shaking now. He stood up abruptly, towering over Karoline, and jabbed a finger toward her. "This is my show," he barked. "You do not get to come here and lie to my audience." Karoline remained seated, unflinching, her eyes locked onto his with an almost unnerving calm. "I did not lie," she said. "You just cannot handle the truth." The audience erupted. Cheers, boos, shouting. The studio was in absolute chaos. Jimmy turned away, running a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. He looked like he was either about to explode or walk off the stage entirely. A voice crackled in his earpiece, a producer desperately urging him to cut to commercial. But Jimmy waved them off. He was too deep in it now. Backing down would only make him look weaker. He turned back to Karoline, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You know what?" he said, his voice trembling. "I think we are done here." He motioned for security, the silent signal unmistakable. Karoline stood up, smoothing her dress, still composed, still dignified, even as the crowd descended into chaos around her. "Thank you for proving my point, Jimmy," she said softly. "You do not want a conversation. You want a monologue." As security approached, the cameras stayed live, capturing every second of the unraveling. Karoline gave one final graceful nod to the crowd, who, despite the confusion and division, watched her, with a mixture of awe and disbelief. And just like that, she was escorted off the stage. Not as a defeated guest, but as someone who had gone into the lion's den and walked out standing taller than ever. Jimmy sat back down heavily, looking shaken, staring at the camera with a hollow expression. The damage was done, and outside those studio walls, the internet was already erupting. Clips of the fiery confrontation were flooding onto social media within minutes of Karoline Leavitt's dramatic exit. No slick editing, no corporate spin. Just raw, chaotic footage of Jimmy Kimmel, red-faced and rattled, ejecting a calm, composed Karoline from his stage. Twitter was ablaze. TikTok was flooded with side-by-side breakdowns. Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum weighed in, some praising Karoline's unflinching resolve, others attacking Jimmy's outburst as a meltdown of epic proportions. Kimmel meltdown trended within the hour. Karoline wins was not far behind. On cable news, anchors scrambled to cover the story. Conservative outlets hailed Karoline as a truth-teller who exposed Hollywood's hypocrisy on its own turf. Even some left-leaning voices hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with how poorly Jimmy had handled himself. Late-night television was supposed to be sharp, witty, biting, not furious, petty, and outclassed. Inside the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, the atmosphere was funereal. Staff members walked on eggshells, carefully avoiding Jimmy's dressing room. He had locked himself inside the moment the cameras cut and refused to speak to anyone. Producers were frantically debating whether to issue a statement or try to spin the incident in Jimmy's favor, but there was no clear path forward. The clip was everywhere. The public had already seen it. No amount of PR wizardry could undo the impression left by the raw footage. Meanwhile, Karoline was trending as a breakout media force. Standing outside the studio, still in her bright, crisp outfit, she answered questions from a growing crowd of reporters with the same calm that had carried her through the brutal on-air ambush. "I think tonight showed America exactly what they are up against," she said, her voice even. "The people who claim to care about democracy, free speech, and unity are the first to silence anyone who disagrees with them." It was a devastatingly simple message, and it was landing. Back inside, Jimmy was finally coaxed out of his dressing room by his executive producer, a man with 2 decades of live television experience who had seen it all, or thought he had. Jimmy looked pale, exhausted. His usual quick wit and biting charm were nowhere to be found. For the first time in a very long time, he looked like a man who understood he had lost a fight he should have easily won. "We have to control the narrative," the producer said urgently. "We say she was disrespectful. We say she hijacked the show. We say she—" Jimmy waved him off, slumping into a chair. "No one's going to buy it," he muttered. They saw it. Even Jimmy's most loyal viewers had started posting uncomfortable clips, moments where he talked over her, shouted her down, resorted to cheap shots when his points fell flat. It was all there, plain as day, no matter how hard they tried to spin it. Later that night, Jimmy's team uploaded a heavily edited version of the interview to the show's official YouTube channel. Key moments, like Jimmy's red-faced shouting and the moment Karoline called him desperate, were conveniently cut, but it was too late. The internet had the receipts. On TikTok, a slow-motion replay of Karoline's final line, "You don't want a conversation, you want a monologue," overlaid with dramatic music, was already sitting at 2 million views and counting. Conservative media personalities hailed Karoline as a steel spine wrapped in a silk glove. Pop culture bloggers called it the single most humiliating moment of Jimmy Kimmel's career. Even people who disliked Trump and everything he stood for found themselves reluctantly admitting that Karoline had handled herself with extraordinary poise under pressure. She had taken on one of the biggest names in television, on his own stage, and left without so much as a hair out of place. By contrast, Jimmy's defenders were scrambling. Some tried to argue that he was right to cut her off because disinformation should not be given a platform. Others said he was justified because there are no both sides anymore. But none of it landed. To the average viewer, the optics were devastatingly simple. One person stayed calm and spoke in complete sentences. The other lost his temper, yelled, and threw her out. It was a cultural gut punch, a rare moment when the mask slipped, and the audience saw the raw, unfiltered disdain so many elites have for those they disagree with. And it was not just political junkies who noticed. The story hit entertainment news, gossip blogs, even morning radio shows. Memes flooded Instagram and Reddit, portraying Jimmy as a child throwing a tantrum, while Karoline stood by like a kindergarten teacher watching with bemused pity. For Karoline Leavitt, it was a star-making moment, an unexpected baptism by fire that she walked through like a seasoned veteran. For Jimmy Kimmel, it was a public relations disaster. The real kicker came the following morning, when national headlines dropped with brutal efficiency. Kimmel meltdown, late-night host. Ejects guest after losing control. On live TV, Karoline Leavitt stands tall. Against Hollywood elites, late night's last breath, Jimmy Kimmel's on-air collapse. Worse still, clips began circulating from other celebrities who had previously felt slighted or mistreated by Jimmy on his show. Old wounds reopened. Stars like Matthew McConaughey and even Jennifer Lawrence had made veiled comments in the past about the hostility behind the scenes at Jimmy Kimmel Live. Now those comments were being resurfaced, reframed under the new narrative of a bully finally getting exposed. Karoline, on the other hand, was already moving on. She posted a simple tweet that morning. "When they can't win the debate, they try to silence you. Stay strong, America." It racked up hundreds of thousands of likes within hours. Meanwhile, Jimmy's showrunners scheduled an emergency meeting. Staff morale was cratering. Some insiders whispered about a possible suspension. Others talked about laying low for a few weeks until the outrage burned itself out. But it was clear. The show had taken a massive hit, and the damage was not just reputational. Sponsors were getting nervous. Brands were calling, asking uncomfortable questions about the incident, about the optics of advertising on a platform now associated with silencing a young female political figure. Jimmy himself, still seething, was reportedly telling friends in private that he had been set up, that Karoline baited him into looking bad. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been caught flat-footed. He had let anger rule him, and America had seen it. But the final blow had not landed yet, because Karoline was about to make a move that would shake the entire media landscape even harder. Early the next afternoon, as the storm from her appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live was still gaining momentum, Karoline Leavitt announced she would be sitting down for an exclusive interview, but not with a sympathetic conservative outlet. Instead, she chose an independent, wildly popular centrist podcast known for its unfiltered, no-holds-barred conversations that attracted millions of viewers from all political backgrounds. Within minutes of the announcement, buzz flooded every corner of the internet. Was Karoline doubling down? Was she going to fan the flames? The anticipation was electric. Even mainstream networks were forced to acknowledge it. The confrontation they had tried to spin, to bury, was only getting bigger. When the podcast episode dropped that evening, it was an instant cultural event. Karoline sat across from the host, calm and composed as ever, and told the full, unvarnished story. She detailed how, backstage before the show, producers had promised her a respectful conversation, how Jimmy's team had assured her that while they might disagree, they would give her a fair chance to speak. "And yet," she said evenly into the camera, "the second I challenged their narrative, the gloves came off. It was never about debate. It was about humiliation. It was about control." She spoke with surgical precision, painting a damning portrait of an entertainment industry obsessed not with truth, but with obedience. She accused late-night hosts like Jimmy Kimmel of hiding behind jokes while pushing political propaganda, and she did it without raising her voice once. Most devastatingly, Karoline revealed, and backed it up with an email she screen-shared during the podcast, that Jimmy's producers had tried to get her to submit her talking points in advance. When she refused, they had sent increasingly aggressive follow-ups, implying that they could shape the narrative however they saw fit if she did not cooperate. That clip alone sent shockwaves through every media outlet in the country. Even people who had been skeptical of Karoline before were stunned. Here was hard evidence, not just accusations, showing manipulation behind the scenes of a show millions trusted for political commentary, disguised as comedy. The backlash against Jimmy Kimmel exploded. Editorials flooded in from all directions. Former guests started sharing their own stories about how they had been ambushed, edited, spun. Even longtime fans expressed disillusionment. "This isn't comedy anymore," one viral tweet read. "This is just propaganda with a laugh track." By Friday morning, Jimmy Kimmel Live was facing a full-blown advertiser revolt. 3 major sponsors pulled their upcoming ads. Others issued carefully worded statements, re-evaluating their partnerships. Jimmy's network bosses held closed-door meetings to figure out whether he could weather the storm, or if it was time to start discussing an exit strategy. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's star continued to rise. Invitations flooded in from news networks, podcasts, universities. Even some late-night competitors, eager to humiliate Jimmy further, offered her guest spots. But she declined almost all of them. Instead, she posted a single message. When you stand up for what you believe, the truth speaks for itself. I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated. America deserves better. The simplicity of it struck a chord that reverberated across the country. For Jimmy, there was no easy path forward. He finally issued a statement late Friday night. Flat, uninspired apology posted to his social media accounts. In it, he claimed that emotions ran high and that he regretted how the interview had ended. But it was too little, too late. No admission of wrongdoing, no real accountability. The comments under his post were brutal. You're sorry you got caught, not for what you did. Maybe you should listen instead of lecture. You proved everything she said about you was true. By the weekend, petitions were circulating calling for the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel Live altogether. Staffers, once fiercely loyal, began leaking stories to the press about the toxic environment behind the scenes. Stories that, before this week, no one would have dared to believe. Karoline, meanwhile, kept it classy. She refused to gloat publicly, refused to throw gasoline on the fire. Instead, she used her newfound platform to launch an initiative focused on media accountability. It was a shrewd move, one that positioned her not just as a one-time viral sensation, but as a serious voice for change. When asked about Jimmy in future interviews, she simply smiled and said, "I wish him well. I hope he learns from this." It was the kind of final grace note that made her look even stronger, and made Jimmy's meltdown look even smaller by comparison. Within weeks, Jimmy Kimmel Live saw its ratings dip to record lows. Sponsors withdrew quietly, one by one. Rumors swirled that the network was already developing replacement options for his time slot. Jimmy himself retreated from public life for a time, blaming personal stress and the divisiveness of the current climate for his absence. But everyone knew the real reason. He had been beaten, fairly, cleanly, and on his own stage. By someone half his age, armed with nothing more than composure, clarity, and the courage to speak truth in a place where lies had reigned for far too long. Karoline Leavitt emerged from the fire not just unscathed, but elevated. She had gone into the lion's den, faced the fury of a jaded machine desperate to tear her down, and walked out standing taller than ever. And in doing so, she reminded millions watching that no matter how loud the noise, no matter how fierce the attacks, one calm voice telling the truth can shatter even the most powerful illusions. Jimmy Kimmel's empire, built on mockery and manufactured narratives, had cracked under the pressure of real conversation. And Karoline Leavitt, poised, fearless, unbreakable, had made history in the most unexpected way. The media had underestimated her. Hollywood had underestimated her. Even Jimmy himself had underestimated her. They would not make that mistake again. Not ever.